Can you tell the launch story with demand gen?
So, Google is a big company, but it's growing and growing every year. More and more people were discovering product via Google search. And it was something that Amazon was concerned about. In a meeting when we were planning the launch, a very senior Amazon executive said, I wonder what would happen if we launched Amazon in Mexico without Google at all. And we left the meeting with what we understood to be the marching order of launch without Google search. There was no proxy. Everybody had launched with Google search. We get into our quarterly business review 3 months after launching, and we report on how things went not using Google. And that same executive says, why did you launch without Google search? And what I learned from that was always make sure big action items are actually the same, because sometimes what ends up being an offhanded, I wonder what would happen if, ends up becoming something that was a multi-month push, 100 people involved, and how do we do it? And all because of I wonder if.
Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
Welcome back to Run the Numbers, the show where we talk with the world's top CFOs, and we're on YouTube. People think that I am AI. But no, I'm CJ, a tech CFO, and my goal is to tease out the playbooks and tactics the best finance leaders rely upon to make you better at your job. On today's show, I'm speaking with Matteo Bryant. Matteo is the CFO of Minted, the design-driven marketplace behind the holiday cards, wedding invitations, and birth announcements that make the rest of us look far more organized than we actually are. Shout out to my wife who orders them. Before Minted, Matteo was effectively the fixer for some of the biggest global marketplaces on the planet, spending years on the ground across Latin America and Europe, helping scale and localize complex businesses at companies like Uber, heard of them, and Amazon. If there was a messy launch, a regulatory puzzle, or operational fire drill, tariffs, Matteo was probably on a plane. He's lived and worked across, UK, Turkey, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Luxembourg, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, and the US. In this episode, we go deep on the Minted Flywheel, how weddings, holiday cards, and life events create a decades-long LTV engine, long-term CAC versus short-term monetization, forecasting extreme seasonality. 90% of this guy's business happens in 1 month. My goodness. The financial cost of pretending to be global, and why US-centric tech companies, they leave some money on the table, thinking that everything is everything. Anyways. Making marketplaces work in emerging markets, from enabling cash payments at Uber in Brazil to how gig models scale differently depending on the socioeconomic gap. And if you like this show, please remember to like and subscribe. It helps us with the algorithmic overlords. And if you're looking to hire the best finance and accounting talent, I'd love to help you. Boy, would I love to help. I run a recruiting service that pairs you with thoughtful, qualified candidates from our warm community of finance leaders, people who voluntarily read about the nerdy stuff I write about. CAC payback periods. You want to read that on weekends? Okay, we can get you a job. Email me at talent@mostlymetrics.com and we can talk. On to today's episode with Matteo Bryant. Matteo, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
So I feel like you're the world's most interesting man. You're now the CFO of an online design marketplace, an e-com company, and you were previously the man on the ground throughout Latin America and Europe for marketplaces like Uber and Amazon. Have you ever seen Pulp Fiction? Because I kind of feel like you're the guy who's the wolf who gets people out of a sticky situation.
I kind of like the idea of me being Harvey Keitel. I have seen the movie. I'm a big fan of Quentin Tarantino generally. I guess to some extent I've fixed things. That is true.
Just to paint some context here, what languages do you speak?
I speak English. I'm from the United States originally. I also speak Spanish and Portuguese. So all the major languages of the Americas, I guess.
And so the Spanish and Portuguese, did you know those pretty well? And that was kind of like your angle to work for some of these huge marketplaces and be on the ground locally?
I learned Spanish just because when I was a kid, my parents said, if you want to do anything besides go to school and be at home, then you need to pay for it. And I went and worked at a grocery store, and it was as a bagger, and it's all me and immigrants mainly from Mexico. So I started to learn Spanish for that reason, but I kept up with it and ended up studying in Argentina for a little bit. And it just became something that was kind of like a professional differentiator, I guess you could say. I was comfortable with working in a different language, and in some ways, when you do that, it's like being in an anthropology class alongside doing work. And so I kind of like that dual challenge.
I did take AP Spanish, but I think I got a 2 out of 5 on that test. So that didn't go too well. I can only imagine trying to do deals and negotiations in a different language.
It can be challenging because now and then you can't find the right word. But what goes a long way is that you're trying. You get better and better and better, but it really means a lot to the person on the other side of the table that you made the effort to speak in their language. That was particularly true in Brazil. I've done a lot of work there. Not many people learn Portuguese. So when you show up and start speaking some Portuguese, you immediately command some attention. And I'd like to say like a little bit of respect as well for having made the attempt.
I love it. It's a great tone to kick off the pod with. What's your favorite city in the world?
I've got to say it's Mexico City. I'm biased. I lived there for a long time. My wife is from there, but it's just a fantastic city, and it's really having a moment right now. For a long time, people thought I was nuts. I lived there for quite a while, starting in 2008, and I was kind of thinking, keep thinking that, because this is like the best kept secret on this side of the Atlantic, right? Now people figured out that it's a fantastic spot. If you go down there now, you will notice a lot of digital nomads move down there, and it's become a tourism hotspot as well. It's very different from Williamsburg, Brooklyn. It reminds me of Williamsburg, Brooklyn in like 2005 when there's all these great bands and artists and startups and all kinds of things coming out of this spot. There's a very particular and cool energy it's got right now.
So there's startups coming out of Mexico City.
Yeah, there's quite a few. A lot of them are really pushing hard in AI first. What's kind of interesting about Mexico, and I would say Brazil as well, as far as startups, is that Latin America got attention pretty early on from some of the bigger startups in the world, mainly because people were using the hell out of things like Facebook and particularly WhatsApp. Then later on, Uber and Amazon, as well as some homegrown companies like Mercado Libre, which has really given Amazon a run for their money all over Latin America. So between some of the large global consumer companies showing up there, and that process started maybe 12 to 13 years ago, as well as some homegrown ones like Mercado Libre or Rappi, which is kind of akin to DoorDash in many ways, there's a lot of growing talent both in Brazil and Mexico. iFood, which is a Brazilian food delivery company, they got bought by Prosus for $6 billion.
Whoa.
Yeah, and they only operate really in Brazil.
I'm pumped to have you here because you're a great guy, and also you just have a different view of business models, right? And where value accrues and how to make them go faster. And I want to talk about some of the flywheels that you've seen in different business models. And when we met, we were at the CFO dinner in San Francisco, and I joked that like people who are like constantly online, they just think the entire world is B2B SaaS, and it's like just not true. We all consume things every day. And you were telling me about Minted, where you work now. And at first, it took me a second to realize you're the one who made me and my family look great on our Christmas card this year.
I hope so. That's fantastic. Yes, we were looking pretty good too, my wife and I. So yeah, we do our job well. What can I say?
Could you describe for the benefit of listeners what Minted does and just how it makes money?
So Minted crowdsources design work from a community. It's all over the world of thousands of artists. And then on top of that, provides customization technology so people can create personalized stationery to celebrate like big life moments. One of our bigger businesses is going to be holiday cards. So I'm sure we all got a whole bunch of those in December and in January. There's other things like weddings. Then, there's birth announcements, bar mitzvahs, communions, things like that. We provide some very up-to-date crowdsourced design work and combine that with the ability to customize it, put in your own picture, maybe change some of the text, move things around such that you can celebrate these moments in a physical way and let everybody know about what's going on in your life.
Can you describe some of the flywheels in the business model?
One is just the simple fact that on our cards, it says Minted on there, and it also gives a shout out to the name of the artist who came up with it. So if you're to comb through all of your holiday cards, if you're like me, I have a desk drawer filled with them going back 10, 12, 15 years. You're just going to go through there and see Minted a bunch of times. Now, we all have these different social circles, and in some ways, you see a card that comes through that has this thick quality, the printing's nice, the design's kind of cool, et cetera, et cetera. You flip it over and you see Minted, and perhaps next year you'll think about using us if you haven't already. That's one element of this kind of virality and flywheel. The other is just as simple as the address book and the group of people you're sending your cards out to. If you want to send out holiday cards, for example, well, you're going to add the names and addresses of all your friends, your loved ones, star sense system. Once you've done that, there's a strong stickiness factor there. The addresses are there. It kind of becomes this new repository of information. You have what your past designs look like. You can see how your card was last year, how your kids have changed, how you have changed. And you're likely to come back each year and add a couple new names and addresses to that list and just continue to send out the minted name because you like the product and because it's really easy for you once you've done that initial step. And over time, there are other things in life that you might choose to go to minted to do, like I mentioned, birth announcements or your wedding. A lot of times things will start with wedding, and then you might later on decide it's time for us to do a holiday card. It might be the birth of a kid. The names and addresses of your loved ones are with us, and we're the go-to place when you want to really celebrate in a more meaningful way, I would say, than just a post on Instagram about something that's happened in your life.
Just reflecting back, it sounds like, and here's my B2B SaaS mind, I'm thinking of top of the funnel here. It sounds like it kind of starts with weddings. Is that kind of like the compelling event that kicks it all off?
Wedding is one of them. Holiday cards is another. It's a big business of ours. And birth announcements is still yet another. And you might also come into the fold because we refer to it as a wholesale business. We sell minted greeting cards in Target, HEB, which is a Texas grocer, Whole Foods, a number of Williams-Sonoma formats. You pop into the store to get a gift and maybe a card or a get well soon, a happy birthday, and you might pick up a minted card. And that's yet another way that you might get into the fold.
Part of it reminds me of on an iPhone, if you don't change off the signature, it says sent with iPhone, or when you originally had the Gmail, it said sent from my Gmail. But like having minted in the corner, and I've seen it before because my parents still hang up every single person's card that they get in the mail. And you just see it when you receive it. It was made by Minted.
In some ways, perhaps obvious as it is, it's something we've been doing for a really, really long time. Minted's been around since 2007. That kind of obvious but very effective virality is in some ways something we kind of pioneered. We came out at about the same time as the iPhone did, for example.
And I'm guessing you as a CFO track customer acquisition costs and lifetime value.
Big time. That's a big topic for us, and it's an exciting one as well because once someone has really come into the fold and chooses to use us to celebrate these moments, in some ways I look at that as just further and further and further amortization of that acquisition cost over time, which is really, really exciting. And given that we're 18 years old at this point, we now have cohorts going back that long, and it makes our LTV and CAC estimates that much stronger that we can really have faith that acquiring someone now means revenue in year 0, 0 plus 1, 0 plus 2, et cetera. We can really prove that is going to happen over time.
That's awesome because like if you get the wedding, right, or say it's the Christmas or the Hanukkah, then you continue to think about it, well, what events can I stack on top of that?
Exactly. How do I be there? How do I make sure that they remember we're out there? But the nice thing about the holiday cards is that's an annual thing. New Year's happens every year, Christmas happens every year, Hanukkah, et cetera. These are annualized events, and it's a yearly reminder that we have an opportunity we have with people to let them know, when other things are happening, we might be able to help you as well. Like your kids are graduating medical school, you want to send out some cards, or high school or college, or you have another child. These are all things we can assist with.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
You just launched your new AI product. The new pricing page looks great. I'm talking crisp. But behind it, last-minute glued code, messy spreadsheets, and running ad hoc queries to figure out what to bill. Customers get invoices they can't understand. Engineers are chasing billing bugs. Finance can't close the books. Well, with Metronome, you hand it all off to the real-time billing infrastructure that just works. Reliable, flexible, and built to grow with you. They turn raw usage events into accurate invoices, give customers bills they actually understand, and keep every team in sync in real time. Whether you're launching usage-based pricing, managing enterprise contracts, or rolling out new AI services, Metronome does the heavy lifting so you can focus on your product, not your billing. That's why some of the fastest growing companies in the world like OpenAI and Anthropic run their billing on Metronome. Visit metronome.com to learn more. That's metronome.com. Here's a growth tax nobody talks about. Every new monetization model you ship creates a nightmare for your finance team. Add usage-based pricing? Now you're tracking consumption against commitments. Launch product bundles? That's multiple performance obligations per contract. Offer mid-cycle upgrades? Woo! Good luck reallocating revenue manually. But that's exactly where RightRev shines. RightRev is the revenue recognition engine built for companies that can't afford to let accounting slow down growth. When your rev rec is automated, your product team can ship new pricing without asking finance for permission. And your sales team can close creative deals without worrying about downstream chaos. To get up on my CFO soapbox for a sec, I love talking about creative pricing models, hybrid pricing, credits, tiered usage. But I've seen too many companies where the sales team is celebrating a huge quarter while finance is still trying to figure out how to recognize half of it. In a world where your pricing model might change 3 times next year, that flexibility is everything. If you want to scale your monetization without breaking your books, visit RightRev.com. That's RightRev.com, where modern monetization meets bulletproof accounting. Being a CFO, you know how much I love tools that actually make the lives of accounting and finance folks easier. One of my favorite tools right now is Rillet, the AI native ERP going head-to-head with NetSuite. Yes, someone is finally doing it. I met Rillet 2 years ago when they were still in stealth. Since then, they've absolutely taken the finance world by storm. Their mission is to make the zero-day close a reality, and they're actually doing it. Customers are literally closing their books at 1:35 p.m. on the first day of the month. They've got everything you need to scale your business. Complex revenue recognition, native integrations, custom reporting, multi-entity, close management, and much more. They're only a few years in and are already supporting NASDAQ publicly listed companies. Yes, seriously. If you want to scale your business on an ERP that wasn't built in the 90s, you need to check out Rillet. Book a demo at rillet.com/CJ. Oh, cool, that's me. That's RILLET.com/CJ. RILLET.com/CJ. Tell them I sent you there. What I love about this is it sounds like you take a short-term view and a long-term view to customer acquisition, because from my limited knowledge of how consumer works, I know how marketplaces work to a certain extent, but you want to be contribution margin positive, like on the very first purchase. Listening to you, you kind of think about it, well, what happens at the entry point in terms of the numbers, and then what happens over time as you amortize that down?
You know, I'm keen to make money on every transaction. It's something I enjoy. It's not to say that I'm not interested in investing in the long haul for customers, but a good example of kind of the shorter term way of looking at that would be like with a wedding, which, you know, I never really thought about weddings so much since I myself got married. Now I think about it all the time, but there's kind of 4 big moments when someone might purchase some kind of personalized stationery. There's the save the date. Then there's the invitation itself that has all the details and all, you know, a lot of filigree and detail. Then there is day of stuff like signage or the menus that might be on the table. And then for all those polite couples out there, there's thank you notes, which is kind of after the fact. Ideally, I get them for all 4 of those. I amortize the CAC across all of those and have a really high conversion from one moment to the other. You know, this wedding event is just the gift that keeps on giving in a lot of ways. As such, we have a wedding websites product, for example, which is an excellent way for people to start to get into the fold. And ideally, they might be able to stretch the same design or kind of motif across from the wedding websites all the way through to the very end with the thank you notes.
This is awesome. Now, this is the inside baseball that people come to the podcast for. So you've taken just this event that we take for granted in our lives. Well, if my wife is listening, I did not take our wedding for granted, but you're hoping you can get that quadruple stack of monetization events.
Perhaps the couple already has a child, or perhaps they have one afterwards. You know, I'd love to help them announce that birth to the world. And then, you know, usually a lot of times the birth of a child is the trigger to start to do the holiday cards. So perhaps the child might be born in May, and then come November, December, it's time to do a holiday card. And now we've gone from perhaps a 4-stage relationship in their wedding to a 5th stage being the birth of the child, and then a 6th and 7th and 8th and so on with the holiday cards, and throw in a graduation event here and there, and perhaps the birth of subsequent children. And now there's multiple touch points per year.
You mentioned seasonality there. I think when we met, it was September, October, and I was making small talk. I was like, oh, how's the end of the year looking to you? And you kind of like threw up your hands and gave me this hilarious example. Like, how do you forecast your business around the holidays?
In some ways, there's something that's really great, which is that the repeat dynamics among our existing customer base is pretty darn predictable. There's a bit of volatility, but it's pretty minor. In that sense, it's easy to predict. But then it all happens in a very short time frame. Most folks do not really consider sending out their holiday cards until the day after Thanksgiving. So Black Friday is a big, huge day for us, as is Cyber Monday. A lot of times you think about it, that big family photo with the autumnal scene in the back, that oftentimes might happen the week of Thanksgiving, for example. Essentially, almost all the holiday card business, which is our biggest, it all happens between Black Friday and a couple days before Christmas usually. Now, there is kind of a secular in all forms of the word trend towards people doing it a little bit later, including sending the cards out in January. So there's a little bit of spillover every year, but it's challenging because if you think about it, Thanksgiving is a floating holiday. It's the fourth Thursday of the month of November. And that could be on November 22nd. And it could be much later. That could be November 28th. And then traditionally, people kind of use the goal, like the end zone is kind of Christmas, depending, but a lot of people. And that's a fixed day. That's December 25th. There's a heady mix of people there and the way people like to do things, and that changes over time. But if you look at it from that sense, my holiday season can vary 6 to 7 days. That changes things. And then also there's just a fiscal year cutoff, which we use a retail calendar that seeks to align those major purchase days, like particularly Black Friday. So my end of year is always the Sunday after Christmas, and that floats around. A, it all happens very quickly. B, it sounds odd, but one day more or less can make a big difference. C, there is this growing secular trend to maybe send your cards a little bit later in the season. And D, because it's just so much happens so quick, small variations can move things quite a bit. So, the eternal question you get from the board of directors is, are you going to hit your numbers this year? And I'm usually saying, well, ask me on December 20th, I'll tell you.
Okay, so I just had a realization as we're doing this podcast that there's such thing as a retail calendar. I didn't know that. So, Matteo, your end of year was December 28th this year?
Mm-hmm. But next year it'll be December 29th, which sounds like a big deal, right? But people out there who actually work with physical product will understand is there's, particularly in e-commerce businesses, one thing is the day that you sell it. Another thing is the day that you ship it. The day you ship it is the trigger for revenue recognition. So one day more, one day less might make a difference between a package getting out according to your retail calendar or not getting out according to that calendar. Now it bleeds into the following year. And the end for the customer, they're not thinking about our retail calendar. They just want the thing on time, and that's our main focus. It's a delicate balance to strike, particularly with the calendar the way it is.
But let's just say half of your business, 50%, is within a 10-day period. 1 or 2 more days on either side of that, like that makes a huge difference.
That selling season for holiday is effectively 5 weeks long, but it varies. It squeezes in, it squeezes out. So yeah, it does make a difference. What's kind of interesting is like, it makes a difference for me in my head. The customer isn't thinking about that. They're just thinking like, oh man, I got to get this done. So they're not thinking about it like, oh, there's fewer days between Thanksgiving and this, December 23rd or whatever their kind of mental cutoff date is.
I bet you're also thinking about the cash flows.
The cash is an interesting thing because we do a big chunk of our business in that time. And it means that we have a bit of a roller coaster action because a lot of the year's revenue is going to happen in that 4 to 5 week period. We don't manufacture the cards. We use third parties for that. So we'll have a lot of cash come in. We're going to get paid 2 to 3 days after the transaction goes through online. And then we'll pay those printers, a month or a month and a half later. So a lot of cash will come in, but then a lot of cash will go back out. I sometimes kind of, when I'm attempting to kind of talk about like cash flow dynamics with a more general audience, I like to put it as, imagine if your salary were $100 a year, but you got paid $50 in December and then, $450 every other month, the rest of the year. That's kind of the dynamic in some ways that we're dealing with. It's a good problem to have. I don't have a problem with it at all. It's just the nature of a business that's seasonal, but it's a different cash flow planning dynamic than we would have if we sold toothpaste or, peanut butter, something that's not particularly seasonal as far as I know.
That's amazing. Well, I'm guessing you don't have a traditional field sales force in this e-com model, right?
No, we don't. One of the things I notice when I meet up with CFO colleagues elsewhere, particularly those who are more of the SaaS variety, they're spending a lot of their time talking with the CRO, which makes sense, about sales plans and bonuses and what kind of discount you might get for locking someone up for a 3-year plan as opposed to a 1 year, those kinds of things. I don't have a CRO per se. I'm spending a lot of time with our marketing team and with some of our category management folks thinking about what we do to increase conversion, what kind of marketing campaigns we're going to do, what's the most effective channel these days, do we need to reallocate cash? And that's a 60 to 90 minute conversation every week. And during holiday season, it's a 60 conversation every day, including on the weekends.
Well, you're talking to a guy who runs a business newsletter for a living. So I finally have a guest who can appreciate that you can't just send one more email and just hope for new business. That can actually be a friction.
This is very true. We had that matter at Amazon, for example. It was actually really fascinating there. Everybody wanted to email the entire customer base about everything at all times. You are the head of the hardware category. You want to tell everybody like, hey, you should be buying your hammers and your screwdrivers and your drills from us. And you want to encourage cross-category purchasing. And that was always a big deal. It still is, always will be at Amazon. And they had the neatest thing there where they had a lot of accumulated information about different kinds of email campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
They also had a lot of information about at what point people became numb to email communications. So you would register the email campaign you wanted to do with the population that you thought was appropriate. It would compete with others, and you would see if you would get a few of those names, all of those names, none of them. Sometimes you'd be like, nope, historically, these aren't very effective. There's 3 other campaigns that are more likely to work. We can't send more than X emails in a given amount of time. No campaign for you. Or there's a lot of overlap with your list and others. You're getting 10% of the names on there. There were other campaigns that were way, way better, but they, where they didn't overlap, you did win for those people for this period of time. And it was fairly automated, and it was always very interesting to see people not always being pleased with the outcome of the decision, although it really did make sense for the overall company. Exactly for what you're saying. It does create friction. It can be kind of obnoxious.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors.
Ali and the team at Tabs are building something that directly addresses one of the biggest headaches I see finance teams deal with today. Pulling data from your ERP, your CRM, your FP&A tools, and your usage systems and actually making it all work together. If you're running usage-based pricing or complex contracts, you already know how this usually plays out. Contracts live in one system, usage data lives somewhere else, billing happens in another tool. RevRec gets layered on top at month end, and finance ends up just reconciling everything by hand to close the books. This is exactly the problem Tabs was built to solve. Tabs is an AI-native revenue platform built for controllers and CFOs. It brings together data from your ERP, CRM, and real product usage into a single system of record. From there, it automates billing, collections, and revenue recognition without finance having to duct tape workflows together every month. If usage-based revenue is core to your business, this is the future of how billing and RevRec get done. Go check them out at tabs.com/run. That's tabs.com/run. We've all been burned. We've all bought that enterprise planning tool that promised the world, only to realize 6 months later that we've basically taken on a second full-time job just to keep the software running. I want to talk about a company that was built specifically to kill that cycle, Abacum. I actually remember my very first conversation with their founder and CEO, Julio Martinez, over 3 years ago. Back then, they were just starting out in Spain. Fast forward to today, Julio moved the home base to NYC, and they're the engine behind finance teams at Strava, Replit, and JG Wentworth. Abacum doesn't turn you into a software admin. The integrations are actually self-service. You don't need a $300 an hour consultant to plug in your ERP or HRIS, and they're doing AI in a way that actually impacts the things FP&A teams are doing every day. Things like creating variance summaries, building formulas, and modeling scenarios. If you're scaling fast and you're trying to avoid that legacy platform trap, Abacum is the move. They're building the future of our tech stack, and they're doing it with a CFO's perspective. Go to abacum.ai to see it for yourself. That is abacum.ai. Well. Here's what nobody tells you about being a CFO. You'll spend 50% of your time on stuff that is killing your momentum. The best CFOs I know are business leaders who know how to drive growth in heroic fashion. But most of us end up spending our days buried in manual work. I'm talking about collecting receipts, reviewing expenses, and manually reconciling spend. It's painful. That's why CFOs need Brex. Brex built an intelligent finance platform that pairs corporate cards with built-in expense management, plus a team of AI agents to handle the manual finance tasks for you. That way, CFOs have more time for the high-impact projects that drive growth. The shit actually worthy of your CFO time. Bottom line, Brex is automating hundreds of thousands of hours of manual finance work every month across 35,000 companies like Anthropic, Coinbase, and DoorDash. Ready to spend less time buried in expenses and more time driving results? Check out Brex at brex.com/metrics. It is brex.com/metrics. Please, guys. How the hell do I have 3 kids in daycare? Brex.com/metrics. It's amazing. You're a very demand gen focused CFO because you can go up to that line of persistent and earnest. But if you step over that line of just being annoying, you may lose all contact with the customer. They may just unsubscribe.
Exactly. And that's an unfortunate thing because let's call it inexpensive to free, depending on how you want to look at it. And it's an exciting tool to let people know we have this new product, we have this new variation, there's a special promotion going on. But if you use it too much, then you're starting to dull its impact and maybe even just render it useless. So it's a tough one. That's why Amazon had such a strict and very data-driven approach, because everybody wants to do it because it doesn't require very much budget. And I have the list of people. I have a reason that I believe that these are the ones we should be speaking to. But everybody can't be talking to everyone at the same time, particularly at a company like Amazon that sells anything and everything under the sun.
How do you think about the retail channels for distribution? Because my wife goes to Trader Joe's grocery store locally near us, and the cards there only cost $1. So she'll grab 5 that she thinks are funny, and she'll keep them for whenever a holiday pops up. Because inevitably, you end up being oh crap, I need a card. Let me go to CVS and pick one up. So we have them just right there in the drawer. How do you think about having these physical brick and mortar locations that you can use to sell cards?
I find it really exciting. It's just another way for us to get in front of our potential customers. Our work in that regard has kind of had 2 prongs. One is that we needed to get good at it. Physical distribution, retail, it's very, very different than online. Among those things, you actually have to get the product physically on the shelf, something that most of these huge retailers like Walmart or Kroger or Target, they require you to pay for that. They do not pay for the stocking. You do as one of the providers. So we spent a good while working primarily with Target and getting good at that. And since then, we've expanded more into other retailers. And that's where the part becomes important, which is focus. Which are the right retailers for you? Because it is a lift to enter into each one. There's CapEx involved with the shelving and things like that. So you want to make sure you're at the right retailer and maybe even the right stores for that retailers. And perhaps your brand doesn't need to be in every single Kroger. Perhaps a subset that might be geographic. It might have to do with demographics at a zip code level. Maybe that's the right way for you to approach it.
And I think depending on who you're negotiating with, the terms can be different, right? I hear anecdotally that Walmart, a lot of times you'll see something on the shelf. It's not like Walmart paid for that inventory. They're basically selling it on consignment, and then they'll pay you 90 days later.
Sometimes it's referred to as scan-based trading. It depends. It's different from category to category, but there are cases where that inventory does not belong to them. It belongs to the vendor, and they only get paid, or the trigger for getting paid is when it crosses that scanner, and then X days after that. Walmart has a lot of power. They're a very large firm, and that's demonstrated oftentimes in the terms and the ways of working with them.
I won't say the company name, but there's a very large auto distributor out there, because I was in vertical SaaS for automotive. We ran a marketplace. And so we would hear about the different terms and conditions from the different part manufacturers. One of these big companies, it's net 365.
I heard something similar about a large beer manufacturer that they paid for their hops 180 days later. During that time, they would brew and sell it and brew and sell it. So they they would spin off that the cash off that initial load of hops would get spun through like 12 times before they paid for the first lot. I always thought, man, it must be hard to make hops.
Let's dig into your period as the guy on the ground abroad. Maybe you could rattle off what countries you've lived in or served extended periods of time in for business purposes.
I have been in a whole bunch of places. That includes the United Kingdom, the United States. I lived in Luxembourg for a spell, Spain, Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. Those are all places where I've lived and or worked for extended amounts of time.
Do you think we are overly US centric when we think about applying what works here to what works outside the US?
That does happen in my experience a lot in tech. There weren't that many huge, large, particularly consumer tech brands 30 years ago. You know, if you were thinking about large consumer brands, now you would mention Google and Facebook. You'd also mention Coca-Cola or Budweiser or others in the same breath, possibly. That wasn't true before. So what I've kind of noticed, because I did work in consumer products, been involved in chewing gum and chocolate. I've been involved in popcorn and canned vegetables at different points in my career. A lot of those large consumer companies that are now ubiquitous. You know, if you go to Ghana, you're going to find Budweiser or Anheuser-Busch or AB InBev products. You're going to find Diageo products. You're going to find Coca-Cola, Pepsi, etc. Those companies realized that they were leaving a lot of opportunity on the table, and they really did have like a cultural transformation. And now if you look at the people who are in the C-suite at a company like Diageo, they've all worked on the ground in multiple like major geographies. You're not making it to the top unless you have that experience. I've not found that to always be the case in tech. And sometimes that makes sense. There's perhaps not a strong reason why Google search should work dramatically different in Botswana or Brazil or the United States. But on other occasions, there's things that might make sense to have a lot of local flavor built into the product. I think payments is a great example of that. Credit card penetration is still pretty low in a lot of places in the world, and you might be leaving a lot of growth on the table if you don't have a product manager who understands that and who's building different ways in order to be able to take things like, this is a common thing in Mexico. There's a ubiquitous convenience store called OXXO, kind of similar to 7-Eleven. And you can go in there, you can book a flight online for a lot of airlines and then go and pay for it in cash at the OXXO. That's the kind of thing that you might miss out on if you have a US-centric perspective. Or frankly, Uber in Latin America, about half the rides come from cash payments, which sounds really odd to the American ear, but that's where a lot of the growth came from, because at the time, the penetration of credit cards and debit cards was in the mid-teens in most of Latin America. That other 85% or so, they were taking taxis. They were getting on the subway. They could be customers. We just had to make it a way for them to do it.
We're going to get to the Uber story in a second here. But what you bring up about meeting the customer where they are with the things they want to buy at that time, like it's such a great point. Because you go to different countries, there are all sorts of wild things you may be able to buy in a convenience store that in the US, you're like, what? You can do that there?
OXXO is a really interesting example in Mexico, but you can pay all of your bills there. You can buy airline tickets there. You can pay for Amazon or Mercado Libre merchandise there. There's a lot of things that go on, and it's because there's still a lot of people who operate in cash. They might still be distrustful of banks in some cases. You know, one of the things that's driven the success of Nubank all over Latin America and possibly in other places in the future is mainly that banks there are a little behind the times when it comes to payment acceptance. So I remember moving to Mexico City trying to buy things with my debit card online, and it seemed like their safety or their risk algorithm just kind of assumed all online transactions must be fraudulent, because sometimes I just couldn't do it. I had no option but to go to the airport and buy this ticket on like in cash, which is just kind of nuts. So sometimes this need to have alternative payment mechanisms is driven by kind of some of these banks being behind the times.
So in a prior episode, we spoke with Peter Oye, the CFO of Grab, which is kind of a super app within Southeast Asia and all the islands there. And they have basically the equivalent of Uber, but also on motorbikes. But then they have lending and they have like 17 other different things that you can do there. He explained that it was a similar experience where not everybody even had a credit card. You had to think about how is the consumer going to pay for this? And also, how is the person who's providing the service, whether that's somebody on a motorcycle who's delivering, a watermelon or giving somebody a ride, how are they going to get paid at the end of the day if they don't have a bank account?
Yeah, there has to be some other kind of mechanism a lot of times. It really needs to work flawlessly because you need to build trust for some of these people. If you're creating some kind of wallet and this person's never even really stepped into a bank, like the notion of having this wallet where your money exists and that you can't see it and you can't touch it, like exactly this moment, you better get it right, or else you might lose the confidence of this person who's willing to drive around in a motorcycle with a stranger grabbing onto them, which is the way a lot of people move around in a lot of different countries around the world.
Can you talk about your experience at Uber and how you went through the different options for payment?
Yeah, it was really interesting time to be at Uber. I started there around 2016, so during the Travis Kalanick era. And when I started Uber, it was operating in 16 cities in Latin America, and it was growing like wildfire. And we wanted to keep on growing. So one way to do that was to launch in more cities. And now I think Uber operates in 400 cities in Latin America. But another way was to get more people onto the platform. And something we heard consistently was, I can't use Uber because I don't have a credit card or I don't like using credit cards a lot. So we needed to find a way to make cash payments work. And what was kind of beautiful about it really was that it was in some ways way easier than you would think. There were some problems around the edges because you think about it, it's like, well, how do you get the money? But then you just start to think about the actual unit economics. If you take a $10 ride, Uber's cut, it changes, it's been different over different moments in time, but at that point in time, it was around 25%. So you take a ride for $10 and Uber is owed $2.50 for that ride. If you think about it, as long as 1 out of 4 rides is done with a credit card, then Uber is going to get the full $10, right? The other 3 rides were handled with cash. So the driver has those $30. Well, on those 4 rides, $10 would have been Uber's cut anyways. So now you can just kind of say, hey, you keep the cash, I keep the credit card receipts. And then the added benefit of that is that you didn't pay transaction fees on those other $30. In this mathematical example, you just cut your credit card fees by 75%. Now, it didn't end up being that it was 3/4 cash, 1/4 credit card. It was more 50-50, and it varied from market to market. Almost always we owed the driver a little bit of money, but we were able to keep all the credit card receipts, figure out how much above and beyond the cash they collected we owed them, transmit that, and it cut down our credit card fees dramatically. But then it also made growth go through the roof. So then essentially it doubled the size of the business and cut our credit card fees in half. And that just became a very, very profitable business by virtue of that growth, by virtue of lower transaction fees, and really by virtue of the fact that people just loved Uber in Latin America. And we didn't have to spend really heavily on driver acquisition or customer acquisition.
Well, it is a CFO podcast, so I guess I can say it's the equivalent of like a cashless exercise. You just net it out.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And, it also gave me a bragging point, when I would talk, I had a colleague who ran the US and another one who ran Europe, et cetera, et cetera. And like, how are you paying only like 1.5%, in credit card fees? And it's like, because I just don't pay them that often. It's just, I pay a similar amount as to everybody else when I pay them.
Because people forget that as the middleman, one of your largest costs are the payment rails.
If the credit card guys take 3%, it can be 2.5%, it kind of depends, but if they take 3% of the total value of the transactions, $10, they're going to take 30 cents. But my cut at that time was $2.50. So that 30 cents is more than 10%. It's a huge amount. So if I cut that 30 cents down to 15 cents on average, so much value to the bottom line. But simultaneously, I've made my product that better for our users. It's more apt for the people in this area. So cash became really, really big at Uber in Latin America and was also, became fairly commonplace in places like Africa and India and a few other spots around the world as well.
Do people overly emphasize Oh, well, what'll happen if somebody just steals the cash? Do you say, well, that's how they make a livelihood, and if they're committed to having an ongoing business, it kind of, I don't know, it balances itself out?
It wasn't a lot of people, but some people did do that. But we figured out ways to get around that. One was just to only route them credit card orders until we got back. And another one was, there were certain markets where there was just not a lot of credit card users. And we created ways for them to go and kind of pay up. Actually, one way was to go to an OXXO, this 7-Eleven like store, and they could pay up what they owed us, and then kind of not be in arrears anymore, and we could start to send them rides again.
Because I've spoken to people before who work in the retail industry, and they talk about when something is stolen as leakage or breakage or something along those lines. But I mean, even what you were saving on credit card fees, Matteo, more than made up for that, like in multiples.
There were $100 million in rides. I could essentially say I saved like 1.5%, like $1.5 million on the credit card fees. And then a couple guys made away with like 25 grand, and it'd be like, well, I'm not thrilled when somebody finds a way to game the system, but it was really, really hard to do. And doing so usually meant that you wouldn't be able to drive for Uber after a certain point.
Well, if we were to zoom back out, what do you think is the true financial cost of companies who are pretending to be global, but they act otherwise?
One thing is just leaving profitable sales on the table, and that can happen quite a bit. And the other one is having to go out and buy someone who did build something that works, a similar product that is tailored for that geography. If you are that person who has the perfect solution for a big market like Indonesia or Brazil that's tailored, that's similar to what one of these global players has, and particularly if you're cash flow positive, you're in no hurry to sell it. You know that they're unlikely to build it at this point. And on the other hand, I've got something, I don't necessarily need them. So if you want to have this superior product in your portfolio, you've got to pay up. So there's likely to be a very expensive acquisition down the line. That happened a lot in CPG companies. Like one thing that comes to mind is if you ever go to Peru, you'll see this product called Inca Cola all over the place. It's very, very sweet. Peruvians love it. Coca-Cola owns it. But there's a point in time when whomever is behind Inca Cola was just killing Coke, and they ended up having to pay up in order to grab that part of the market. And those are the kinds of things that might not happen if you're willing to adapt to the conditions on the ground. And you can become the right product for the right geography.
Well, while we're on the topic of gig economy models, you've said to me before in passing that gig economy models work best when the socioeconomic gap between the buyer and the seller is largest. How do you think that shaped Uber's success in Mexico if you try to compare that to the US?
What ends up happening is that you might have a person who's in the car who is willing to pay $10 to go to the airport. They're also willing to pay $30 to go to the airport. And the person in the car is willing to take $7.50, which would be their share of that. And certainly they're willing to take more on the $30 trip. That's a transaction that can happen. It can happen all across the spectrum between 10 and 30. And there's plenty of people willing to pay that. And obviously there's people willing to earn on throughout that whole thing. Now, if you take that to San Francisco, no one's going to take you to the airport for $10. Absolutely not, right? So that's a transaction that's just not going to happen. Just kind of using my San Francisco experience, but I don't think I've ever gone to the airport from my home for less than $35. So it's just kind of as simple as that. When there is a bigger difference in the socioeconomic pyramid, which there certainly is in places like Mexico, Brazil, and India, the relative distance between the upper echelons in that pyramid and the base of the pyramid that tends to be providing them, that distance is just way, way greater. They're a little bit more inelastic on both sides about what they're willing to earn and about what they're willing to pay, which just means that the window where the market clears is way, way bigger. Whereas in the United States, I think we've all had the experience now and then where we say, you know what, I am going to take the AirTran to JFK, right? I don't know if I'm going to pay $180 to go from Wall Street to JFK in an hour and 45 minutes when I could jump on the AirTran for $7.
Well, to that point, I had a similar experience last week where I took the Metro North train in from my town to New York City. It was $14.50. It was technically actually $29 because I dropped the first ticket on the rails and was debating climbing in to get it and said my life is actually worth enough that I have to pay again. That sucks. But it's $14.50 if you don't have fat fingers like me. I missed the train on the way home, and the next one was like an hour and a half later. And I'm like, I'm tired. I want to go home. It was $250 Uber to get back.
It's a trade-off, but not everybody's going to make that one. Whereas I would venture to say in a similar situation, if you were in Sao Paulo or Mexico City, it just wouldn't have been that dramatically more expensive.
Yeah. And I think you also have to think about in a gig economy, what's like I'll call it the net present value of somebody's time. What's the value of someone's time? Someone may be sitting there and they don't have another job to do. So the difference between getting paid nothing to sit there and getting paid $5 to drive you to the airport, that's a lot.
Absolutely.
I want to touch on tariffs for a second here. Something I am not smart on because I've never sold anything you can touch. But you've worked in models with extensive supply chains which are impacted by tariffs from Amazon to now Minted. What are some of the creative workarounds to tariffs you've seen in your time?
For a long time, for example, I was on the team that launched Amazon in Mexico, and I had to learn a bit about tariffs then because they did something interesting. That launch was very unique in that it was the first time that Amazon had launched with both like a catalog of products that was sitting in warehouses in Mexico, but they'd also done all the work up front to be able to import stuff directly from the warehouses in the United States into Mexico to the consumer. So they launched with that, and it was about 50-50. The catalog was half the stuff on there was in the United States, and half of it was in Mexico. If you spend some time in Mexico City or Mexico at all and gone to, let's say, like a expensive manufactured good, like a washing machine, you're going to notice that a washing machine in Mexico, if it's not made there, it costs way, way more than it would in the United States. The tariff situation is quite different. That's because Liverpool, for example, which is a large department store chain in Mexico, well, they're importing en masse a whole bunch of dishwashers or washing machines or DVD players or whatever it was at the time. So they're the importer of the record, and they're bringing in 2 giant containers full. When the importer of record is the customer, there's actually an upper threshold where there's no tariffs at all. And also, even if the product is more expensive than that threshold, the tariffs are lower than what they would be if you were a person importing containers and containers full of these. From one day to the other, maybe like a Bluetooth speaker that might be imported by some department store in Mexico and have lots and lots of tariffs on it and cost the customer like $100 at the store. You could buy that same one out of an Amazon warehouse, sent to you. You are the importer, and it's going to cost you like $55. And so for the customers, it's just like a revelation. Like if some people go from Mexico to the United States specifically for shopping trips, particularly to buy electronics and textiles and things like that. And now we could just bring all that stuff to them. And that was one of the creative solutions that was used for quite a while. My understanding is that I believe it was Temu was doing the same thing, but the other way around. They were operating some warehouse facilities in like Tijuana and other places along the border and sorting the people in the southern half of the United States from there because it was more inexpensive to run those warehouses. But since then, those loopholes have been shut to a large extent, I understand. So
I love some good arbitrage. Hey, while we're on the topic of Amazon, can you tell the launch story with demand gen?
That was pretty crazy. It was a big learning for me. Google's just this massive company, and they've been a massive company for a while. But if you were to go back 10 or 15 years, they were a fraction of the size they are now in revenue. So, Google is a big company, but is growing and growing every year. Their search product, more and more people were discovering product via Google search. And it was something that Amazon was concerned about. They were wondering, is there a future where I might need to pay Google for every one of these transactions? And how do I, become a direct source where people go to discover products? In a meeting when we were planning the launch, a very senior Amazon executive, a person who reported to Bezos, said, I wonder what would happen if we launched in Amazon in Mexico without Google at all. Like we didn't buy any keywords, none at all. Wouldn't that be fascinating? And we left the meeting with what we understood to be the marching order of launch without Google search. Like don't buy any keywords. And, I was trying to forecast like what's going to happen. There was no proxy. Everybody had launched with Google search. My numbers were all sorts of right and all sorts of wrong. We get into our quarterly business review 3 months after launching. We're sitting in the room, we're talking about demand generation and marketing channels, and we report on how things went not using Google. And that same executive says, "Why did you launch without Google search?" And what I learned from that was, one, always make sure you're in some kind of senior meeting that what you think are the takeaways, the big action items, are actually the same. And also, if you are that person who is giving those action items out, do the same thing, because sometimes what ends up being an offhanded comment, and you just, I wonder what would happen if, ends up becoming something that was a multi-month push, dozens, if not, maybe 100 people involved in, like, how do we do it? And how do we juice up these other acquisition channels? All because of I wonder if kind of.
All right, Matteo, I'm going to take you into what we call our long ass lightning round. So you're a successful man, successful CFO, a fixer in multiple languages, but you got to give me one thing you've messed up on the job before.
Quarterly business reviews that you have at Amazon it's an opportunity to shine in front of a whole bunch of senior people. It's a really intense moment. Those meetings are usually 90 minutes, and the first 45 minutes is just people reading. It is true what they say about it, reading a memo that you've written. And 6 months post-launch, I still hadn't hired anyone. I was running the entire show myself for Amazon Finance in Mexico. The recruiters are jammed. They were hiring vendor managers. They were hiring people to, make sure our inventories are correct, all kinds of other things. I didn't have any FP&A people. So as I'm preparing for this QBR, I'm filling in the blanks about, this much growth, this much margin, et cetera, et cetera. And I looked at the wrong column and put in all the wrong numbers. Oh man, it was just so humiliating because, it was something like, we thought we were going to finish at 1, we finished at 1.2, and that means that we grew 12%. It's like, no, that's 20%. I went with my boss, say, like, I'm really sorry. Like, the results are there, but I just messed up this key moment. And he told me something that's very true, is that not every hour of every day is worth the same thing to you as an employee, as an executive, as in terms of your career. There are people who you only see 4 times a year for maybe 90 minutes. And this is a time when I was in such a meeting, and they're going to form their entire opinion about you based on 3 to 6 hours in a year. And there's other people that you're in a room with for 3 hours a day. It really matters more to get 100% on those 12 hours a year than 100% on those 500 hours a year that you're going to have with this other person, because you have an opportunity to recover if you make a mistake. And I've really taken that hard since then. So I very much will over-index my time on things like board of directors presentations or things like that. And sometimes I feel like maybe I'm going overboard, but in the end, it's very true. And it's something I sometimes tell, different colleagues or kind of informal mentees, is those 12 hours count a lot. And if you want to get an A+ on something, you might want to get an A+ on those 12, because it'll carry you really far.
It's so true. Not every hour is created equal. I feel like that was a big unlock as well from me in my career, where I would study for this 15-minute spot in a presentation because I knew the CEO and CFO would be listening. I would stay up like really late the night before because I wanted to nail it, because I think if you get that right, then it can turn into 30 minutes of exposure, then 45 minutes. But you got to nail whatever stage time you're given.
There's different work relationships that do have a more sausage making aspect, and in there, not to say you should be sloppy, but there's more latitude for making a mistake or figuring something out, or having, coming to a conclusion that's 70% true, but 30% of very strong caveats. And those other moments, you're building trust with this group of people, and to have everything ticked and tied in every answer, and being able to go 3 to 4 to 5 levels deep on any kind of line of questioning, it makes a huge difference for you. It makes a huge difference in gaining trust from whomever those individuals are. And it'll probably give you a bunch of leeway to operate in the between time between those board of directors or QBR or investor pitches, whatever it might be.
Matteo, can you walk me through your finance software stack? What tools does your team use to get the job done?
We use NetSuite. We implemented it about 3 years ago. We were on QuickBooks for quite a while. We use Avalara for tax. For FP&A, we use good old-fashioned Google Sheets. I love Google Sheets. I know it's not perfect, but I also know that I'm a little bit behind at this point, and there's a lot of really exciting AI products out there that I need to start to look at. Like the finance tech stack that uses AI now, they're starting to come in their own, and I'm going to need to request a little bit of roadmap time. Some of them are getting pretty exciting.
Well, the blessing of this podcast, Matteo, is you're about to get hit up by 50 hungry BDRs.
They're in my inbox every day as it is, but this is the year where I'm going to start to think about what's the right software for us to start using.
Last one I got for you, a fun one. What's the craziest thing you've ever had someone try to expense?
There was a fellow at one of my prior employers. We kind of did a cursory sweep to see if there's anything odd in some of the credit card transactions and the expense accounts. And there was a 7-day cruise. We thought that was a bit peculiar. I just asked around, did any team do some kind of bonding team morale event that involved a cruise? Yeah, so we ended up confronting this fellow and asking, what's going on with the 7-day cruise? And he's like, well, it wasn't for me. It's like, well, this was a consumer company, so it's not like, you didn't buy it for like a large enterprise contract or, who is it for? He's like, well, it's for my wife. I've been working really hard lately, and that's more weight on her. So I just thought the right thing to do would be for my employer to invite her.
Selfless act. What happened to that person?
They were not with the company very much longer after that. That was kind of the tip of the iceberg, and we found a lot of other things.
Yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Matteo, this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for carving out time for us.
My pleasure. Really exciting stuff.
Run the Numbers is a mostly media production. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. Artwork by Meg D'Alessandro. Show is executive produced by Ben Hillman. Nothing said on this podcast is intended to be business or investment advice. It's the sole opinion of me, a guy who feeds his dog way too much ice cream and has a history of net operating losses. LOL. If you like this podcast, hit subscribe and give us 5 stars. It will take like 2 seconds and our algorithm overlords love it. Drink water, call your mom, and have a great day. Peace.